been a while since I checked in on video here to give progress on the repairs on the Yamaha Grizzly. Actually did quite a bit that I didn't video, and kind of apologize for not doing that, but what I've been working on is the CVT assembly, or constant velocity transmission setup. Some people refer to this as a clutch. I don't really like to refer to it as a clutch because there's a actual clutch assembly, a wet clutch assembly that's internal to the crankcase behind the front sheave pulley assembly of the CVT. So what I did was I got the thing running really well and rode it around for a day. Actually, the wife drove it most of the day. I drove the old Arctic Cat, and we had some fun with it, but I noticed that the clutch wasn't grabbing as well as I thought it should. So I decided that since this was the ATV that took a drink in the lake and sat unused for so long, I better open this up and see what I would find. And sure enough, I did find some interesting things. First thing you got to do to get this open is, if you've already gotten this far, that's great. You're going to remove this vent tubing assembly over here, which involves removing the plastics, which I already had off because of the top end rebuild that I did. And then you remove all of the bolts that hold this cover in place. The manual actually also references, I believe it references removing the floorboard assembly and I think the rear brake lever maybe, but what I found and what most people have already determined is that you can actually push down the rear brake lever. Push down the rear brake lever far enough so that you can actually get this cover off without removing all of this hardware. Okay, now I've got the cover removed. Just to kind of give you an idea of what I found inside here. I've already cleaned this up a lot. I've already removed the two sheave assemblies. Your wet clutch, by the way, is behind here. Unlike some other ATVs like the Kawasaki Prairie, I've run that with the clutch assembly off just to listen to the motor for motor noise, and no problem at all. I discovered on this Yamaha, what happens is there's an assembly right here, and an oil seal and a spacer. And what happens is, as soon as you start the engine and develop oil pressure, this little spacer can get popped out and you'll have a massive oil leak. So not a good idea to try and run this without the assembly in place. Anyways, inside this area here, where you can see a lot of corrosion in that, there was actually what looked like it could have been maybe a mouse nest or some kind of just debris that was all caked in there. It's a combination of what looked like dirt, mud, leaves, and grease, and who knows what else. And there's actually still, I haven't cleaned the inside of this cover yet, there's actually still quite a bit of that inside here. You can see it. This is going to need to be cleaned out. I've cleaned out all of the heavy debris and everything that was in here, and then I took the primary assembly apart where the rollers and everything were, and that was also where it should have had nice clean grease inside there. It was full of all kinds of garbage, and so I ended up taking care of that, and I'll get to that in a moment. I just wanted to talk for a moment about removing these sheave assemblies. Removal's pretty straightforward. They talk about a lot of special tools in that on some other makes and models of ATVs, holders and whatnot. The reality is, on this one here, if you've got an impact driver, which is what I used, you can zip this nut right off and also zip this nut right off. The key to getting this apart is you need to take the primary sheave assembly off first, and then on the secondary assembly there's actually a couple of holes that you thread in a couple of long bolts. They're the same size as the bolts that come out of here, but what I did was I went to the hardware store and sized these. I forgot what size they are, they're metric. Got a couple of bolts that were a little bit longer, and you drive those two bolts in, and what that does is that spreads that sheave assembly and allows the belt to drop down to the smallest diameter here. What that does is that gives you just enough clearance to then get the belt off of the back half and shaft here on the primary side. So once you get it off of here, then it's just a matter, you can just leave the belt on there, or you can release the bolts and get the belt off and out of the way, and then you put your impact driver on here and you get this nut off, and then you can pull them both off. And they weren't even stuck or anything, and if they were seized, it looks to me like maybe you might use a puller in this situation, but again, like I said, they came off pretty easily. These shafts, even though the grease had a lot of water and dirt and everything mixed into it, overall it was still in pretty good shape as far as not being seized up. Here's the secondary assembly, and these are those two holes I was talking about. This actually faces outwards when it's on the quad, and then you can thread in these. This is a bolt from the cover. You can actually thread this right in there. I actually went and got a couple of, they're actually a little shorter than the cover bolts, but they work perfectly fine. I thread these in. Main reason I did that was I just didn't want to risk bending one of these cover bolts. So you thread those in, and that spreads this apart, which does it fairly easily, considering that when this is fully assembled, this huge spring is actually what's holding them closed. This spring, this is exactly how it came out, all rusty. I'll wire wheel this up, and then I'll measure the free length of it and make sure it falls within spec before I reinstall it. The rest of this I had already cleaned up, and actually I already started reassembly here, but I'll slide this off just to give you an idea of how this comes apart. First thing you got to do is you got to get this spring off. The spring is held on by this collar and this large diameter nut, which is kind of shallow. There's a special tool that you can get that compresses that, and it has almost like a cup with an opening on it, and then you can get a special sized, it's almost like an open end wrench, spanner wrench, that goes in there and allows you to loosen this. There are a number of ways to get away with not having to do that. In my case, I found that I could actually push down on this while I spun my impact wrench on there, and actually had this on the ground and had my feet on here holding it, and it came right off pretty easily. Getting it on is going to be more of a trick, but I'll worry about that when I get to it. What I did was I bought a socket that fits this. This is obviously metric. Don't know what size it is, but even if you figure out what size it is, good luck finding the socket. As opposed to went to my local hardware store, Sears, and got this Craftsman socket. This is a 1 3/4, and it's a perfect fit. Works fine. So that's how I got that off with an impact driver. And then that zips off. The spring assembly comes off. Then this lower collar that actually holds the bottom half of the spring captive, that slides up and off. It's a little tight because I've got new O-rings in there. And then I'm not going to take it all the way out. I'm just going to take it off far enough so you can see. Then once you get that out, you remove these 3 little pins. They're almost like buttons. You remove those 3 little buttons, and then you can slide this half of the sheave off of the sleeve that it's on. Then you take it all apart, you clean it all up, and I replaced these 2 O-rings. There's one here and there's one just behind here. Replace the O-rings, grease it all up, and reassemble it. But before you do that, you want to do what I did to the sheave faces here, which is you take a like an emery cloth or a Scotch-Brite type pad on a wheel. I used almost like an angle die grinder because that made it real easy and quick to do. And then you rough up that surface. So I'm not really scratching it badly or gouging it. You're just roughing it up because it becomes, there's a few problems. It becomes glazed, and the other issue is that in this case here, who knows what may have been on it for contaminants. This is the half of the inner half of the primary, and you can kind of see that finish that's on there. And what that does is that's going to help give it a little more grip. And then the other thing I did was, because again I was worried about contaminated grease residue and oil and whatnot, I also cleaned it really well with a zero residue type of solvent. So that's all cleaned up and put back together. And then of course the grease. Now there is a special grease you can buy through Yamaha, but I went online and checked around and saw a lot of people saying that basically what you want ideally is like a marine type high temp water repellent or water resistant grease. What I decided to use, because my local auto parts store had it, was this Coastal brand by Warren, Uniplex Premium High Temp Grease. It's U-joints and wheel bearings and fan hubs and etc. And that's what I ended up using. So it's not waterproof or whatever you want to call it, but I mean all grease is pretty much water resistant, or repellent I should say. And then it's high temp, which is the more important thing. And so I used that to grease this up. So, and I also cleaned out thoroughly. There was down inside here, there's almost like an area that the grease really can get packed into, and that was all in there. It was the consistency of earwax. It was really waxy and disgusting. I cleaned all that out by running a rag through there on a screwdriver and scraping around and just working it back and forth and spraying some solvent in there to loosen it up and then cleaning it. And I finally cleaned that up all nice. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure I put a liberal amount of this grease inside there and on the shaft when I reinstall this, to make sure that gets also greased. So that pretty much takes care of the secondary once I clean up the spring, and if the spring is okay, and I reinstall it. And the primary was a bigger deal. I'm sorry, that's actually the outer part of the primary. The inner is, oh, here's the inner. I haven't done this one yet, so you can see what the inner looks like. It's kind of got a real shine to it, and I'm going to scuff that up just like I did on these other ones. And then here's the secondary. And the secondary, so this actually faces towards the crankcase. And the reason why I've got it sitting like this is because I didn't want any contaminants to get on that nice clean face. But if I would have flipped this over, you would see that there's a cover right here, and this cover is held on with several small screws. And if you remove that cover, there's an O-ring behind there. And I replaced the O-ring. I cleaned out all of the gook and gunk and hardened waxy type grease that was in there. Removed every single roller, cleaned every roller thoroughly, checked the specs on the rollers. If they're too far out of round, or if they're cracked or damaged, you need to replace them. Check the ramps for cracks or damage or excessive wear. They look good. There's little guides in there also. I didn't really video this, but there's plenty of videos out there on YouTube of people rebuilding these, and there's also different thoughts on putting in greaseless weight systems and whatnot. What I did was I cleaned up all the original OEM parts that were in here that were still in good condition and re-greased it thoroughly with the high temp grease I just showed you. Basically, you want to use about 1 teaspoon of grease per ramp section and roller. You don't want to put too much more than that in there, because basically after the thing runs the first time, all that grease gets thrown out through centrifugal force down towards the outer edge anyways, and you don't want excessive grease in there that might come out and cause other problems. Although that's what the cover with the O-ring here basically does. It keeps that from flying out of this gap right here at high speeds and getting all over your belt and causing all kinds of nightmarish problems. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start reinstalling. Okay, cleaned up the spring, just wire wheeled it. The free length of the spring is adequate. I'm not surprised. This quad had low hours on it, and the rust was only surface rust. Now getting this back on is the tricky part. You've got to compress this down to a point where you can thread this nut on to here. And again, special tool makes it kind of easy, but not going to invest in an expensive tool for something I don't plan on doing on a regular basis. So here's my plan that I've come up with, and we'll see how it works. What I'm going to do is I just found out, just for the heck of it, I tried. I can use the heel of my palm on both hands. So if I put Can't really do this with the camera in my hand, but I basically put one palm here and one palm there. I can actually compress this far enough. So the trick is, if I had a third hand or a helper available, I would compress it and then ask them to thread this on as I held it until the threads, enough of the teeth are grabbed on the threads there, and then I could finish it off with the impact driver. But since I don't have anybody here to help me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put this nut on here like this and compress it with the nut and then twist it as it's compressed to see if I can get it to go in. Now, to help it slip, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a light dab of grease right on the top of the spring here. This is just the surface of the spring that actually comes in contact with that top guard or holder, whatever you want to call it. And that's going to help it spin for me. So we'll give it a try. Well, that plan didn't work. So I had to resort to getting a helper. So I went down the street and tried pushing it down with my hands while another guy threaded a nut on for me, but it seemed like my hands were always in the way of where the nut needed to go. So we devised a plan. He had a large, like, spanner type wrench laying around his shop that kind of, if you can imagine, it had like forks on it, kind of where my fingers are. I pushed down like that on this side, while he pushed down with a large screwdriver on this edge, and then with his free hand he started the nut on there, and then once we got it started to a safe point, we eased off, and then I finished tightening it. And earlier I had said that I picked up a 1 3/4 inch socket to take this off, and to add insult to injury, that socket doesn't seem to fit. So I'm not sure exactly which socket I had picked up. This one I think I was using for the axle hub nut on my Dodge truck because I was working on the front end. So I'm not sure what size socket I ended up getting to work on that, but I did pick one up, obviously, because I had gotten it off. So for tightening it back on, I'm using this large pipe wrench to tighten it. The torque specifications for this nut are 75 foot-pounds. No Loctite on these threads according to the service manual. And the free length on that spring, when the spring's uncompressed, should be between 4.83 and 4.96 inches. I looked it up just in case anybody needed it. And then you install the secondary sheave and the primary sheave, and you install them. The primary is installed and torqued first to 65 foot-pounds, and then the secondary is also torqued to 65 foot-pounds. Okay, before I install the secondary sheave, I'm going to grease this up real well, and down inside here it gets greased up also. Okay, you install the secondary drive, hand tighten this nut on. There's no washer on this one. There is a washer on the primary side right here. So just hand tighten it to start, because we're going to put the primary on first, install the belt, and then we torque the primary first and then the secondary. Okay, I've installed the inner half of the primary, and I've dressed the face of it prior to that. And now I've installed these two bolts. You run these bolts all the way in to expand this sheave. Now that I've got the bolts all the way in, you can see how this is opened up. It's going to allow me to install the belt. Now the belt has arrows on it. You have to find the arrows, and the arrows should point to the front of the vehicle. Now this is what screws a lot of people up. What you have to do, the reason why we spread that sheave, is so that you can pull this belt in far enough. It's going to give you just enough slack to get over the end of this shaft and pop it in like that. And then the other thing you want to do is you want to avoid getting any grease on this belt. So now I hold the belt out of the way and I grease the shaft. Now I'm going to install the other half of the primary sheave. Now you want to make sure this is fully seated on there. You should be able to see the end of the splines there. A little bit of grease squeezed out, so just wipe that off so we can see it better. But you can actually see the splines. And so now I can install my washer and my nut. Now this nut gets torqued to 65 foot-pounds. Once this nut's torqued to 65 foot-pounds, we can remove these two bolts and torque this nut to 65 foot-pounds. Okay, it's all installed and it's all torqued. Then you just kind of make sure the belt isn't bound down in there after you've released the sheave by removing these bolts. And now we can start the motor and run it and actually accelerate in neutral and watch the action to make sure the sheaves are opening and closing properly.